Well, let's get our Bibles ready. And David, good to see you back home. God bless you. I guess you're home for a couple weeks, are you? Yep. All right. Very good. Well, make sure you say hi to David Almonia. All right. Being Christmas, I wanted to do something of a Christmas theme in our Bible study tonight, and so I thought we might talk about Joseph in the New Testament. We know that he's the husband of who? Mary, right? You got that one right. But aside from a few mentions in the Gospel, there's really not much written about Joseph. He's not mentioned in any of Paul's writings. Interesting, isn't it? For such a man that had such a prominent role to play in the birth, the nativity, the coming of Christ. But he was a wonderful man, no question about it. Now, let's open up our Bibles here to the New Testament book of Matthew, chapter 1. And you're going to need a little bookmark because we're going to be doing a little bit of back and forth. And so Matthew chapter 1. Put a bookmark there, and then go over to Luke. And I guess we'll go to chapter 3. We'll start in chapter 3. We're going to be looking at a couple of little verses here and there. Anyhow, I spent a long time gleaning as much as I could find on Joseph to share with you tonight. And I think you'll find it interesting because there's some things in there that are specifically written, and then there's some things that we learn by deduction. But the life of Joseph also holds some life lessons for us. And so we want to be ready to pick up those little nuggets. So let's have a word of prayer, and then let's start in with our study on the life of Joseph. Our Heavenly Father, help us to understand something about Joseph. We will be meeting him in heaven. And Lord, we thank you so much for him. He seems to be just a wonderful believer who loved you. And Lord, help us to learn some things from his life that maybe we can apply to our own. And we'll thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let's start in Matthew chapter 1. And very simply in verse 19, this, of course, is after Joseph learned the news that his espoused wife Mary was great with child, or at least found with child anyhow. Verse 19, do you have that open? Would you read that out loud with me, please? Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. And so I just want you to notice three words: a just man. And in other words, he was saved. He was a righteous man. Now, he was living in Nazareth. That's where this takes place. But the most important thing here is that he was saved, and he loved the Lord, and get this, he obeyed the Lord. He not only loved the Lord, but he obeyed the Lord. And you know what? If you think about it, how can a person not obey the Lord if they claim they love the Lord, right? It goes hand in hand, doesn't it? If someone, a man or woman, claims to be saved and they claim to love the Lord, there's going to be an obedience in their lives to what God has for them. And we know that we have God's revealed will in the Scriptures, things he tells us that he wants us to do. And then we have his concealed will, things that we don't know yet, like maybe what job he wants us to work, or what ministry he'd have us to do. And these things are concealed, but as we follow him, he reveals them to us. And he'll only reveal them to us if we're willing to obey him. If we're not willing to obey, he's not going to reveal to us any concealed truth. He'll just wait until we come to a point of obeying the revealed, and then he'll reveal the concealed. Does that make any sense? Yeah. You all look a little on the tired side. You've had a hard day Christmas shopping, haven't you? trying to figure out what color of necktie to buy your pastor. Well, boy, you know, I tell you what'll really wear you out is driving in this traffic. Yeah, because everyone and their dog is behind the wheel. And they don't have a whole lot of patience at Christmas time. It's called Christmas rage. Maybe you've heard of road rage. This is Christmas rage. And boy, don't get in their way. So anyhow, that's why probably a lot of people are staying home and doing their shopping online, have it delivered. Well, anyhow, back to the message here. First thing we learn here about Joseph is that he's a saved man, a righteous man. He lives in Nazareth. But have you ever wondered who his father was? Have you ever wondered? Because everyone gets a father, right? You know that. That's how God set it up. Everyone is allowed to have a father and a mother. You knew that, didn't you? Yes? Yeah. Okay, so Joseph had a father. Well, let's see in verse 16 here. It says, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary. So what does it say his father's name was? Jacob, right. Anyone miss that one? That's an easy one, isn't it? Okay, let's go over to Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. And here we have in verse 23, it says, and Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph. So there's Joseph, the husband of Mary, which was the son of who? Say it, I can't hear you. Heli. Did you get it? Did you miss it? Did you get it? So in one gospel, what's Joseph's father's name? Jacob. In another gospel, what's Joseph's father's name? Heli. So guess what the unsaved do with this, right? And they say, oh, ha, 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 there's that Bible of yours again, the Bible you claim to be so perfect, all full of errors. It can't even get Joseph's father's name right. It's that bad. And that's the kind of thing that the unsaved world does. But the unsaved world is crazy. Boy, they're one to talk. They can't get anything right, it seems. And the Bible is right. You say, well, then why does it have two names here? Well, there's a couple of explanations. But the most logical is this. There's two genealogies. And I say, well, two genealogies. That's right. King David had a lot of children. He did. He had a lot of wives and he had a lot of children. What's the most famous son of King David? Solomon, right. So he's going to be in one of the genealogies. But there's another son he had by the name of Nathan. And he is in one of the genealogies as well. Now, in Matthew traces the genealogy from King David down through Solomon to Jacob to Joseph. So in Matthew, the genealogy is traced down from King David down to Jesus. In Luke, the genealogy is traced up from Jesus to King David. However, in Matthew's gospel, from King David to Solomon, down through to Jacob, and then Jesus. But in Matthew, it's Jesus, Heli, up through Nathan to David. So there's two genealogies there. And say, why are these two names? Well, if you go back to Matthew, only this time actually go to 22, Matthew 22, we have a quote, a clue, if you will, from the Old Testament. And this is probably one of the best explanations. This is not something that the world is going to understand because they were never brought up this way. They never knew these teachings of God and these scriptures. But in Matthew 22, we have here in verse 23, we've got these Sadducees, and they're a miserable bunch, and they were always trying to trip up Jesus. They never could. But it says in verse 23, they say that there's no resurrection. And yet, they come out with this story about this woman who marries a guy, and the guy dies, so his brother comes in, and you know the story? And 7 brothers, and they all die. Mysterious, isn't it, why 7 men would die under one woman? But anyhow, they say in verse 28, therefore in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? Well, these clowns don't even believe in the resurrection. According to verse 23, that was part of their doctrinal statement. No resurrection, they don't believe in it. Well, verse 24 says, Master Moses said, now this is a quote out of the old book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Now this had real life implications, and it all had to do with God keeping the Jews Jewish and keeping Israel as a one big happy family. Now, if you were to look at the 2 genealogies, you would look, of course, you'd see Nathan, you'd see Solomon, and you trace down, you'd see Heli, you see Jacob, and the name before is maybe the key. And so we'll just take a quick look at that. So back to chapter 1, and we looked at verse 16. Look at verse 15. It says, Mathan begat Jacob. Jacob begat Joseph. You see that, Mathan? See that, Mathan? Yes? Okay, now go over to Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3, and we had looked at verse 23. So here's Heli, verse 24, which was the son of Mathat. Now Mathat may be just a variant spelling on Nathan. You get that sort of thing. And for example, Elijah, Elias, that sort of, it's just a variant spelling is all it is. You'll even get in the Old Testament variant spellings of a name. In the New Testament, you'll get that. And so if these were the one and the same man, then it would make Jacob and Heli brothers. And so it stands to reason that Jacob may have just died. He married a girl and died, and so his brother came and raised up children, and that's why you have 2 genealogies, like 2 names, 2 different names as the father. So you have the legal one and you have the biological one. So anyhow, that may be the answer as to why there's 2 names there. But it's certainly within reason. It's not far-fetched at all. Okay, let's move on with a few more things about Joseph. We know that he was a carpenter. Now, a carpenter is not like a carpenter today. Carpenter today often belongs to a union. You know, they'll make $100 an hour, you know, gold-plated hammers and so on. It's a highly respected trade. Carpenters back then were different. Carpenters today, you know, will kind of build houses and, you know, they'll build a shed for you, I guess. They'll do renovations on your home as a carpenter. The carpenters back then more dealt with large, heavy timber. They would be the ones who would make maybe large, heavy ox carts or the wheels or something. Their craft was a little. Now they worked with wood, but it was a heavy, slogging kind of a trade, and it was a humble trade. No one got rich being a carpenter. There are tradesmen today who do very well. They make good money. And that's fine, that's great, nothing wrong with that. But the tradesmen back 2,000 years ago, they didn't make so good a money. And Joseph was a carpenter, which probably means that his father was also a carpenter. So maybe Heli was the carpenter who taught Joseph how to be a carpenter, who in turn taught Jesus how to be a carpenter. But something else about Joseph is that he was a poor man. Now we know that as evidenced by an offering that they gave. If you go to Luke chapter 2, and verse, let's see here. Okay, we got verse 21, the circumcising of Jesus. Verse 22, the days of Mary's purification. And they came to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written, verse 23. Verse 24, and to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law. Now that's back in Leviticus 12. A pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And we're not going to talk all about that and the reasons for it, but that these offerings were poor offerings. These 2 small little birds were something they offered to the Lord, evidence of the fact that they were very poor people. There's nothing wrong with being poor. It's despised these days. And I'm sad to say that a lot of young people, they go to college and university, and they expect that when they graduate, they're going to walk into a 6-figure salary, with 4 weeks off vacation, paid vacation, and company benefits, and medical and dental, and clothing allowance, and car allowance, and a company jet. And wow, what's happened here? Because it wasn't that long ago that it was more commonly understood that after you graduate from school, that you start at the bottom rung and you work your way up. And so things have changed quite a bit. But Joseph, he was a grown man, and he was a carpenter, probably a good carpenter too, but he was a poor man. There's nothing wrong with having very little money. There's nothing wrong with that. The Lord is the one who makes both rich and poor. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Something amazing, though, about Joseph here is that he received not one visit by an angel. Now, if you had ever had a visit by an angel, one would change your life probably, and you'd write about it in your memoirs. Not 2 visits by an angel. Joseph had 3 visits by an angel. Imagine that. The first one, of course, was telling him to take Mary to be his wife. Do you remember that? He was figuring out what to do with Mary because, as far as he knew, she's not supposed to be pregnant, which means she must have been doing something she shouldn't. And so he didn't want to make a public example, which means that she would have been stoned to death. He wanted to put her away privately. The marriage contract they had back then, their engagement period was for a year, and it was also to prove the virginity of the girl. And so in that year's time, if she wasn't a virgin, then it's supposed to be evidenced. And all of a sudden, there's Mary in that year, and she starts to show. She's got a child. And so everyone thought, and they were talking, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. She's obviously done things she shouldn't. And Joseph loved her and was a just man. And he was thinking, well, how can I do this? How can I put her away and cause her the least amount of pain? And as he was thinking about this, he fell asleep, and in his sleep he had a dream, and this angel came to him and told him, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife. And the angel explained it to her. The second time that Joseph had a visit from an angel was after Jesus was born, and after about 2 years, as much as 2 years, and then the wise men came, and they worshipped Jesus and gave the gifts. And then Herod was fit to be tied when he found out that he was fooled. So that's when he gave the commandment for his soldiers to go and to kill all of the children, the baby boys, 2 years of age and under. And an angel came a second time and told Joseph to take Mary and the child and flee into Egypt. And that's, of course, in Matthew chapter 2. And in the same chapter is the third visit by an angel, where when they were in Egypt, the angel came and told them that Herod's dead and go back into Israel. And of course, when they came back in, they didn't go to Bethlehem, they went back to Nazareth. And so here's the next thing about Joseph. Joseph brought his family, his little family, to Nazareth, and he fathered more children. Guess how many kids he had? Someone's going to say a dozen. Go ahead, say it. We don't know. We don't know exactly, but we know what the minimum is. And the minimum is 6. He had 6 more, which Jesus would be 1, and then 6 more, 7. So a minimum of 7 kids, probably more, but he had a minimum of 7 kids. Now, Joseph was still alive. He lived for many years after, and he was still alive when Jesus was 12. Now, if you're in Luke chapter 2, you'll see this story here, verse 41. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast, and when they had fulfilled their days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and his mother knew not of it, but they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance, and when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem seeking him, and came to pass that after 3 days, can you imagine? 3 days. They must have kind of gone out of their mind a bit here, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. So my guess is that they went a day's journey, and then that night they couldn't find him, so they came back a day's journey to Jerusalem, and then in that next day, that's when they found him. I think that's the 3 days spoken of here. But obviously Joseph is still alive at this point. But he didn't make it to Jesus' ministry, because Jesus was how old when he started his ministry? Anyone? 30, and by that point Joseph had passed away, and he probably had passed away a few years before Jesus turned 30. Now there's an interesting prophecy in chapter 2 of Luke. I want you to look at it. It's an interesting prophecy that suggests that Joseph was not going to live to see Jesus' ministry, and it's here in verse 34. Simeon, he's an old guy, and he was in the temple when Mary and Joseph came to present Jesus before the Lord. And so, verse 34, Simeon blessed them and said unto Mary his mother, Behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against, yea, a sword shall pierce through thy, that's singular, thy own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. And so here's a prophecy that Simeon makes concerning Jesus, no doubt when he's betrayed and beaten and nailed to a cross. And the prophecy is to Mary. Well, where's Joseph? Where's loving, godly, faithful Joseph? He's not mentioned here. And so it's quite likely that there's an indication in this prophecy that by the time Jesus got up into his ministry and was betrayed and so on, Joseph was long dead. because it was Mary whose heart was going to be pierced through with this sword. Now, of Joseph's other children, they're mentioned, and we're not going to look at it all, but they're mentioned in Matthew chapter 12, chapter 13, Mark chapter 3, chapter 6, Luke chapter 8, John chapter 2, Acts chapter 1, and 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and the Apostle Paul speaks of James, the Lord's brother, in Galatians chapter 1. Now, of the brothers, there seems to have been 4 who are named, and that I'd like you to see if you go back to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. These are the words of the folks from Nazareth. So Jesus was a little toddler when Joseph and Mary and Jesus came back to live in Nazareth. And so these are the townsfolk. And when Jesus came back and was a preacher all of a sudden, they took offense to this. Verse 55, Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, they said, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brethren," count them, James, that's what, number 1, and Joseph, that's number 2, say it, and Simon, number 3, and Judas, number 4. Now that's not Judas Iscariot, that's another Judas. Jude, Judas, those names are related. That was a popular name back then. But there's 4 of the brothers that are named right there. So there may have been others, but we don't know. But there's at least 4 there. Now, both Matthew and Mark talk about Joseph's daughters, but we don't know how many, because they're not even named. And if you look at the next verse, verse 56, you see the same people, they go on and they say, "and his sisters," plural. So there has to be at least how many? 2. There has to be at least 2 sisters there. There could have been more, probably were. But there's 6 children, 6 siblings to Jesus. And so it could have been Joseph, Mary, and 7 children. But there may have been more than that. And so these brothers and sisters, they're not all mentioned. Even the Lord, in his beginning of his ministry, they're mentioned when his mother went to Capernaum in John chapter 2 for the wedding. You remember that? They went to the wedding. And the brothers and sisters went along with them. That's in John chapter 2. Now, folks, believe it or not, that brings us just about to the end of what there is to know about Joseph. And so I want to just wrap it up with what can we learn from Joseph. 3 lessons. Number 1, stay humble and love and obey the Lord. That's lesson number 1 that we learned from Joseph. Way back even before he was actually married to Mary. He was a humble man. He loved the Lord. He was faithful. Number 2, something that we learn from the life of Joseph is love your family and be faithful in the regular services for the Lord. And that's what Joseph was. Every year they made this trek up to Jerusalem. That cost them time. It cost them money. He had to close down his carpentry business there for those days when they made this trek. But why? It was important to him. And the things of the Lord need to be important to you and I. And there's a great lesson to learn from the life of Joseph, is love your family and be faithful in the regular services of the Lord, and bring your family and make the Lord the center of your family. And you know what a lot of Christians do is they get their family going, and then they get their career going, and then if there's any time left, they get their church going. their service for the Lord. That's backwards. Put the Lord first. The Bible even says so. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. We're always to put the Lord first. And the world certainly doesn't do that. And many of us get saved out of the world, and so we bring this thinking with us into the house of the Lord. And that's why we need to change that. The ones that have the best opportunity are children that are raised right in the house of the Lord, because then church just becomes normal. It's never a question. Well, are we going to go to church on Sunday? Should we or shouldn't we? It's just never a question. Sometimes you get mom, dad, and you got 3 or 4 or 5 little ones, whatever, and all of a sudden one little one gets sick. Well, all of a sudden then they say, none of us can go to church because this little one is sick. And yet on Monday, the little one will stay home, maybe with mom. The rest of the kids go to school. Dad goes to work. No one stays home because it's just, that's just what we do. But our worldly thinking, I think, shoots us in the leg. We're our own worst enemy sometimes. We need to put the Lord first. And that's exactly what Joseph was like. He was a humble man. He loved the Lord. He put the Lord first, and he was faithful. He loved his family, and he was faithful. The third lesson is be prepared to do extra service for God, that Jesus Christ will be exalted. That's exactly what Joseph did. This whole thing in the virgin birth, this was well beyond the call of duty. This was way beyond taking the child and fleeing to Egypt. He did it because the Lord told him to. Way beyond the call of duty. Coming back and having to set up again. Again, another big upheaval and so on. He did many things that were beyond the call of duty. And there's a lesson we can learn from Joseph. There's really nothing else that I'm aware of that's taught in the scriptures about Joseph. But these things are, and the 3 lessons, the life lessons that I think we can get from Joseph, is that he was a humble man that loved God. He loved his family, and he took his family with him on regular service to the Lord. And number 3, he wasn't afraid to go the extra mile and to do something above and beyond for the Lord. So how about that? That's a good lesson, life lesson from a humble man, isn't it? There's other things about Joseph perhaps that we'll learn when we meet him in heaven, because he's up there rejoicing right now. But for now, that's about all the scriptures tell us. It's amazing, though, I find that a man that was so greatly used, that there's not more spoken of Joseph. However, it is what it is. And let's be thankful, and let's take it and learn from it. So let's look to the Lord in prayer now.